The first sound wasn't the splintering of wood, but the gasp of a dead man's secret. It exhaled from the dark space beneath the floorboards, a century of silence breaking in a single, shuddering moment. And in that moment, Elara Vance's world, a world held together by overdue bills and diluted hope, ended. It ended and was remade into something terrifying and vast. If you're ready for a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to let us know where in the world you're watching from in the comments below. Now back to the silence and the fortune that shattered it. The air in the Orpheum Grand Puppet Theater was a physical presence, thick with the dust of forgotten performances and the cloying sweetness of decay. It coated Elara's tongue and clung to the back of her throat, a taste of time itself. She stood center stage, a single beam of afternoon light cutting through a grime-caked window high above, illuminating her small frame in a hazy celestial spotlight. The light was a liar. There was nothing celestial about this place. It was a tomb, a derelict vessel of memories she had no part in, inherited from a man she'd never met. Great-great-uncle Silas. The name itself felt like a relic, something dug up from a box of sepia-toned photographs. The family spoke of him in hushed, cautionary tones, the eccentric who had locked himself away with his wooden children, the madman who claimed the theater was more alive than the city outside its doors. They called it haunted, a convenient explanation for the unease it radiated. An unease that had settled deep in Elara's bones the moment she'd first laid eyes on its boarded-up facade. Her 7-year-old daughter, Maya, sat on the edge of the stage, her small legs dangling over the dusty orchestra pit, humming a tuneless song. She was unafraid. To her, this wasn't a mausoleum of failed dreams. It was the world's most elaborate playhouse. While Elara saw rot and shadow, Maya saw possibility. She'd found a single puppet left on a velvet-draped chair backstage, a queen with a chipped porcelain face in a gown of faded silk. Now she held it in her lap, tracing the fine cracks in its painted expression with a gentle finger. The inheritance had been a shock, delivered in a crinkled manila envelope by a mail carrier who looked at her with pity as if he knew the contents were just another burden. The lawyer's letter was brief, devoid of sentiment. Silas Vance, having no direct heirs, had left his sole remaining asset, the theater at 1412 Sparrow Street, to the last traceable branch of his family tree, to her. The property was condemned, the back taxes were monumental, and the lawyer had advised her to sign it over to the city to be demolished. It would be the cleanest option, but quote one was a luxury Elara couldn't afford. Clean was for people who didn't have to choose between paying the rent and buying groceries. This wreck, this pile of bricks and ghosts, was an asset. It was something, and something was infinitely more than the nothing she had. So she had come, crowbar in hand, determined to assess what, if anything, could be salvaged. A few antique light fixtures, perhaps some copper piping, enough to keep the lights on in their tiny apartment for another month. She had started on the stage, the heart of the theater, tapping the worn oak planks with the heavy end of the crowbar. Most had responded with a dull, solid thud, but one, just off-center, had answered with a hollow echo, a resonance that spoke of empty space beneath. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't had the energy for in years, had flickered to life. She'd wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam and pushed. The wood, brittle with age, had groaned in protest before giving way with a sharp crack. And then the gasp, the exhalation of stale, trapped air. Elara knelt, her knees protesting on the hard wood, and peered into the darkness. It wasn't a crawl space. It was a compartment, a carefully constructed cavity lined with what looked like lead, and inside, stacked with an impossible geometric precision, were dozens upon dozens of rectangular objects wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. Her first thought was books, or ledgers, the ramblings of a madman. She reached in, her fingers trembling slightly, and lifted one out. It was heavy, far heavier than paper. With clumsy, numb fingers, she worked at the knot. The twine crumbled into dust. She unfolded the oilcloth, its waxed surface cracking under the strain. Inside was a stack of paper. But it wasn't a book. It was currency. Old currency, large and ornate, bearing the faces of presidents she barely recognized. Beneath it were more stacks, and beneath those, something else. She reached back into the cavity, her hand brushing against coarse canvas bags that clinked with a heavy, metallic music. Gold coins. And then she saw the portfolios, leather-bound and embossed with the names of forgotten banks. She opened one. Bearer bonds, crisp and perfect, their values listed in denominations that made her vision swim. This wasn't a stash. This wasn't a life savings. This was a fortune, a dragon's hoard, a weight of wealth so immense it felt like a physical pressure, pressing down on her, stealing the very air from the dusty room. Tucked into the lid of the compartment was a single yellowed envelope. Her name, Alara Vance, was written on it in an elegant, spidery script, a hand from the grave reaching for her. She tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a recent appraisal from a discreet international firm, dated only a year prior. It listed the contents of the compartment with cold, factual clarity: gold bullion, rare coins, pre-regulation bonds, and antique currency. At the bottom of the page was a single underlined number: $358 million. The crowbar slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered onto the stage. The sound echoed through the vast, empty theater, loud as a gunshot. Maya looked up, her song silenced. Alara couldn't answer. She couldn't breathe. The dust motes dancing in the sunbeam seemed to mock her, swirling like tiny golden coins in the light. The family was wrong. The theater wasn't haunted by a ghost. It was haunted by a secret. And now, the secret was hers. The world outside the Orpheum Grand had vanished. The sounds of traffic, the distant wail of a siren, the mundane rhythm of the city, it all faded into a dull, irrelevant hum. Alara's universe had collapsed to the dimensions of the dusty stage, to the dark, gaping hole in the floor, and the impossible number printed on the paper, trembling in her hand. $358 million. The number was an absurdity. It was a phantom, a string of digits with no connection to her reality of expired coupons and secondhand clothes. She tried to conceptualize it, to translate it into tangible things. It was not just a new apartment. It was the entire building. It was not just a reliable car. It was a fleet of them. It was a lifetime, 10 lifetimes, of never having to look at a price tag again, of never having to say, "We can't afford that," to her daughter. The thought should have been liberating. It should have been a tidal wave of relief, of joyous, incredulous laughter. Instead, it was a suffocating weight. A cold dread, slick and oily, seeped into her veins. This kind of money wasn't a blessing. It was a cataclysm. It did not solve problems. It created new monstrous ones she couldn't begin to imagine. Maya, sensing the sudden, seismic shift in her mother's demeanor, slid off the stage and walked over, her small hand clutching the porcelain queen. Quote, "44?" she asked, her voice a small, pure sound in the oppressive silence. Alara quickly folded the appraisal and stuffed it into her pocket, her movements jerky and unnatural. Quote, 5. The lie felt clumsy and brittle on her tongue. It was the first of many. She looked from her daughter's innocent, questioning face to the hoard beneath the stage. The contrast was dizzying. Maya's world was one of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and the simple, unwavering belief that her mother could fix anything. This secret, this dragon's hoard, was a poison that could curdle that world instantly. How could she protect her from this? How could she possibly explain a fortune that had appeared like a conjurer's trick? A fortune that felt fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong. A low groan of stressed metal from the front of the theater made her flinch. It was probably just the old building settling, the wind whistling through a broken pane. But in her heightened state, it sounded like a footstep, like an intrusion. Paranoia, cold and sharp, pricked at the back of her neck. Who knew about this? The lawyer who had sent the letter? The appraisal firm that had valued the contents? Silas himself had known, and he had hidden it, buried it under the feet of his wooden performers. He hadn't spent it. He had guarded it. Why? She gently lowered the floorboard back into place. It settled with a soft thud, the seam barely visible. The stage was whole again. the secret swallowed back into the darkness. But she knew it was there. It was a living thing now, a silent, slumbering beast beneath her feet, and its presence changed everything. The very air in the theater felt different, charged with a new and dangerous energy. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, the silence more profound. The rows of empty, decaying velvet seats were no longer just seats. They were silent witnesses. The ornate, gilded proscenium arch, peeling and tarnished, felt like the gaping maw of some great beast that had swallowed her whole. "Can we make the puppets dance, Mommy?" Maya asked, holding up the queen. "Can we put on a show?" Elara looked at the puppet. Its painted smile seemed fixed, knowing. Its glass eyes, once just beads of color, now seemed to hold a deep, ancient sorrow. She imagined Silas on this very stage, surrounded by his creations, the sole audience to their silent dramas. Was he a madman, or was he a prisoner? "Not today, baby," Elara whispered, her voice hoarse. "This place, we need to be careful." She took Maya's hand, her own palm slick with a cold sweat. She needed to get them out of there, out of the charged silence, away from the weight of the floorboards. As they walked toward the massive front doors, the sliver of light from the high window caught something she hadn't noticed before. On the wall beside the stage, almost lost in the gloom, was a small brass plaque. It was dull with tarnish, but the engraved words were still legible. She ran her fingers over them, clearing away a layer of grime. Quote, 10. It was a strange epitaph, a puppeteer's philosophy perhaps, or a warning. At the door she paused, her hand on the heavy iron bolt, and glanced back. The theater was a cavern of shadow, the single beam of light a solitary, defiant spear against the darkness. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, she thought she saw movement in the wings, a flicker of motion where there should have been none, a trick of the light, a product of her frayed nerves. It had to be. She pulled the heavy door open, and the sudden influx of daylight and city noise was a physical shock. They stepped out onto the cracked pavement, and Elara quickly bolted the door behind them, the sound of the heavy lock clicking into place, offering a sliver of comfort. She stood there for a moment, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun. Maya's small hand, a warm, real anchor in a world that had suddenly become unmoored. Across the street, a black sedan was parked by the curb. It was nondescript, its windows tinted to an impenetrable darkness. It hadn't been there when they arrived. There was no reason for it to be there, on this deserted, forgotten street of warehouses and condemned buildings. As she watched, a flicker of red light, small as a firefly, appeared and then vanished in the driver's side window. The flare of a lighter. Someone was in the car, watching. The dread in her stomach coiled into a tight, cold knot. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't her imagination. Someone else knew. Or at the very least, someone else was waiting. The secret was already straining at its leash. The walk home was a blur. The familiar city streets seemed alien, distorted by the new lens of fear and disbelief. Every stranger's glance felt like a scrutiny, every passing car a potential threat. The black sedan had not followed them, but its image was seared into her mind, a symbol of the unseen forces that had just been activated in her life. Their apartment, usually a cramped but comforting haven, now felt like a cage. The thin walls, the rattling window frames, the drip of a neighbor's faucet, sounds that were once the background noise of her life were now potential intrusions, evidence of their vulnerability. Maya, blissfully unaware, chattered on about the puppet castle, drawing pictures of the porcelain queen on a scrap of paper. For her, the day had been an adventure. For Elara, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Sleep offered no escape. She tossed and turned, the number from the appraisal flashing behind her closed eyelids. $358 million. It was a mantra of pure terror. She dreamt of puppets with hollow eyes and knowing smiles, their strings stretching out into an infinite darkness, tangling around her, pulling her down. She dreamt of the black sedan, its engine a low, predatory growl, its dark windows reflecting her own terrified face. She woke before dawn, her heart pounding against her ribs, the dream's chill still clinging to her skin. She couldn't go on like this. The secret was too heavy to carry alone and too dangerous to share. There was only one place to look for answers. She had to go back. She waited until Maya was at school, a knot of guilt tightening in her stomach as she kissed her daughter goodbye at the gate. Every routine action felt freighted with a new, terrible significance. This was her life before. She had no idea what after would look like. Back at the theater, the morning light did little to dispel the gloom. If anything, it made the decay more visible, highlighting the peeling paint, the water-stained walls, the thick, undisturbed shrouds of dust. The black sedan was gone. The street was empty, save for a few scraps of windblown trash. A small part of her relaxed, but a larger part knew it meant nothing. A hunter doesn't need to stare at the trap to know it's been set. This time, she came prepared with a powerful flashlight and a small backpack. She locked the heavy door behind her, the sound echoing her own determined heartbeat. She made her way directly to the stage, the beam of her flashlight cutting a clean white circle through the darkness. She knelt and lifted the floorboard. The horde was still there, silent and inert. It hadn't been a dream. She left it untouched. The money wasn't the answer. It was the question. The answer, if it existed, had to be somewhere else in this building. It had to be with Silas. She started her search in a small, cramped office backstage. It was a time capsule. A thick ledger sat open on a roll-top desk. The last entry dated 50 years prior. The ink was faded, the handwriting a spidery, almost indecipherable scrawl. It detailed ticket sales, repair costs for the building, the purchase of silks and porcelain for new puppets, the mundane finances of a dying business. There was nothing to suggest the owner was sitting on one of the largest private fortunes in the country. Leaning against the wall was a large leather-bound trunk secured with two heavy brass locks. It looked ancient. This had to be it. She located the crowbar again, and with a surge of adrenaline, wedged it under the lid. The old metal screamed in protest, but the locks gave way. She lifted the heavy lid. The scent of old paper and cedar filled the small room. The trunk was filled not with valuables, but with journals. Dozens of them, bound in worn black leather, their pages filled with the same tight, spidery script from the ledger. She picked one at random from the top. The date on the first page was over 60 years old. She sat on the dusty floor, the beam of her flashlight her only companion, and began to read. Silas Vance's voice emerged from the pages, not as a madman but as a poet, a philosopher, and a prisoner. He wrote about his puppets not as inanimate objects, but as vessels. Each one, he explained, held a story. They were his confidants, his congregation. But it was the passages about the theater itself that made Alara's blood run cold. He called it, quote, 12, quote, he spoke of a promise made long ago, a sacred duty passed to him. He never referred to the fortune as, quote, 13. He called it, quote, 14, or quote, 15, or quote, 16. He wrote of its origins, not in a single, clear narrative, but in fragmented, allegorical flashes. He spoke of a great fire, of a community scattered to the winds, of families who entrusted their futures to a single honest man. They had given him their wealth, their deeds, their heirlooms, everything they could not carry, with the promise that he would safeguard it until they or their descendants could return. But they never returned. The community was erased, its name scrubbed from the city maps, its story buried under new developments and willful amnesia. Silas and his father before him had become the silent, eternal custodians of a ghost's fortune. He wasn't a miser hoarding his gold. He was a sentinel, guarding a promise. Quote 17, he wrote, the ink slightly blurred as if from a tear. Quote 18. The wolves. The phrase sent a chill through her. Was the black sedan one of the wolves? Had they been circling this place for decades, waiting for the old sentinel to die? She kept reading, her fingers smudged with dust and ink. He detailed his lonely existence, how he had used the theater as a shield, the reputation for madness, the stories of hauntings. He had cultivated them all. They were his scarecrows, his defenses against a world he could not trust. And then she found the entry that mentioned her family line. He wrote, quote, 20. He hadn't just left her a building. He had left her his post. He had passed on the duty, the burden, the curse. She was the new sentinel. A phrase from the brass plaque echoed in her mind. The strings are attached to everything. She finally understood. The money wasn't free. It was tethered to a history of pain and loss. It was tied to a promise made to ghosts. And now the strings were coiled around her. A sudden, sharp rap on the massive front doors of the theater shattered the silence. Elara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound was impossibly loud in the dead quiet of the building. It wasn't the wind. It was a fist. Someone was outside. Someone was knocking. And they knew she was in there. The knocking came again, louder this time, a series of 3 sharp, impatient raps that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. Elara's breath caught in her chest. She snapped the journal shut, her mind racing. Who could it be? No one knew she was here. She hadn't told a soul. She scrambled to her feet, extinguishing her flashlight and plunging the backstage office into near-total darkness. The only light was the faint, gray illumination filtering in from the main theater. Silence. She stood perfectly still, every nerve ending tingling with adrenaline, straining to hear any sound from outside. For a long minute, there was nothing but the frantic thumping of her own heart. Maybe they had left. Maybe it was just a random vagrant, or kids daring each other to knock on the door of the haunted theater. Then she heard it, the soft, metallic scrape of something being inserted into the lock. Her blood ran cold. They had a key, or they were picking the lock. This wasn't random. They were coming in. Panic, raw and primal, seized her. Her eyes darted around the tiny office, searching for an escape route, a place to hide. There was a single grime-covered window high on the back wall, but it was too high to reach and likely painted shut for decades. The only way out was through the theater, past the stage, and out a side exit she'd noticed earlier. But to get there, she'd have to cross the open space. She'd be exposed. The heavy bolt on the front door groaned, a long, drawn-out shriek of tortured metal. They were inside. She heard the massive door swing open on its creaking hinges, then shut with a soft, definitive click. Footsteps. 2 sets, she thought. Measured, confident, echoing slightly in the vast empty space of the auditorium. They were not exploring. They were searching. Quote 22, a voice said. It was a man's voice, low and cultured, but with an undercurrent of something hard and dismissive. Check backstage. The city records show the property transferred to a relative, a single mother. She might have been here already. Elara flattened herself against the wall in the deepest shadow of the office, her body rigid with terror. A single mother. They knew who she was. This wasn't just about the theater. It was about her. The footsteps grew closer, crossing the main floor, approaching the stage. She held her breath, praying the darkness of the backstage area would be enough to conceal her. She could hear them stepping onto the stage now, their footsteps directly above the hidden compartment. Did they know? Were they here for the money? The first voice asked. Quote 25. A second, rougher voice replied. Quote 26. A beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness of the wings, sweeping across the dusty ropes and sandbags. Elara shrank back, pressing herself harder against the cold plaster wall, convinced the light would find her. The beam swept past the office doorway, a blinding white slash that lasted only a second, and then it was gone. Quote 27, the first voice said, his footsteps now moving off the stage and toward her hiding place. This was it. They were coming. She had seconds to act. Her eyes fell on a stack of old show posters in the corner of the office, their edges curled and brittle. An idea born of pure desperation sparked in her mind. As the footsteps approached the office door, she grabbed the topmost poster, a garish depiction of a demonic-looking jester, and flung it out into the hallway on the opposite side of the backstage area. It landed with a dry, rustling crash that sounded deafening in the silence. The footsteps stopped instantly. The rougher voice hissed. The first voice said, his tone sharp. Elara heard one set of footsteps move away toward the source of the noise. The other set remained just outside the office door. He was waiting. She knew this was her only chance. She had to move now, while one of them was distracted, taking a slow, silent breath. She slipped out of the office, moving in the opposite direction of the decoy sound. She moved like a ghost, placing each foot with painstaking care on the dusty floorboards, her body a coiled spring of tension. The side exit was 50 feet away, an eternity of darkness and shadow. She could see the faint outline of the door, a slightly less black rectangle in the gloom. Halfway there, a floorboard beneath her foot let out a low, agonizing creak. The footsteps outside the office stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a suffocating vacuum of pure dread. She froze, her muscles screaming, certain he had heard her. She could feel his unseen gaze sweeping the darkness, searching. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then she heard the rougher voice call out from the other side of the stage. The man outside the office grunted in response. The footsteps resumed, moving away from her, toward the office she had just vacated. The path was clear. Ilara didn't wait. She broke into a silent, desperate run, her sneakers making no sound on the thick layer of dust. She reached the side door, her hands fumbling in the dark for the lock. It was a heavy panic bar. She pushed. It wouldn't budge. Rusted shut, trapped. Her mind screamed. She pushed again, this time putting her entire body weight into it, a sob of pure terror catching in her throat. The mechanism groaned, then gave way with a loud metallic bang. She stumbled out into the narrow, trash-filled alleyway, gasping in the cool, clean air. She didn't look back. She ran. She ran harder than she had ever run in her life, her lungs burning, her legs pumping. She didn't stop until she was several blocks away, hidden in the anonymity of a bustling downtown street. Her body trembling, her mind reeling. They had been in the theater. They knew who she was. They were searching. The wolves Silas had written about were no longer circling. They were inside the walls. The frantic escape from the theater left Ilara adrift in a sea of paranoia. She didn't go home. She couldn't. The thought of leading the men in the dark suits to the one place Maya felt safe was unbearable. Instead, she walked, her path aimless, her mind a frantic storm. She ended up at a small public library, its quiet, orderly atmosphere a stark contrast to the chaos raging within her. She found a secluded Carol in the back and sank into the chair, her body trembling with residual adrenaline. They knew her name, a single mother. The words echoed in her head, a cold, clinical assessment of her vulnerability. They had researched her. They knew she was alone, that she was struggling, that she would be seen as an easy target. But what did they want? If they knew about the money, why not just take it? Why the search, the pretense of investigation? Perhaps they didn't know the exact location. Or perhaps, she thought with a sickening lurch in her stomach, there was more to it than just the money. Silas's journals were still in the trunk. She had left them behind in her panic. The thought was a fresh wave of nausea. Those journals contained the story, the context, the names of the families whose wealth he was guarding. The money was the prize, but the journals were the map to its history, its legitimacy. Without them, the fortune was just a pile of untraceable, indefensible cash, a vulnerability. With them, it was a legacy, a weapon. She had to go back for them. The thought terrified her, but the alternative, leaving the story in their hands to be twisted or erased, was worse. She needed help. The realization was as clear as it was terrifying. She couldn't do this alone. The lawyer who handled the will was the obvious choice, but she dismissed the idea immediately. He had been so quick to advise her to demolish the theater. Was it expediency, or was he part of something larger? She couldn't take the risk. The police were also out of the question. What would she tell them? That she'd found an undocumented, untaxed fortune of $358 million, and that shadowy men were now after it. They would confiscate the money and launch an investigation that would put her and Maya under a microscope for the rest of their lives. She was trapped. Her isolation was a weapon being used against her. She spent hours in the library, not reading, but thinking, trying to piece together a plan from the shattered fragments of her reality. She thought about Silas's words. The wolves have long memories. This wasn't a new threat. It was an old one. The men in the theater were just the latest iteration of a danger that had shadowed Silas for 50 years. They represented the forces that had destroyed the community whose wealth he protected. They weren't just thieves. They were trying to finish a job, to erase the last remnant of a history that stood as an indictment against them. As dusk began to settle outside the library's large windows, an idea began to form. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one she had. Silas's ledger, the one in his office, had been filled with the mundane details of running the theater. But she remembered seeing recurring entries, payments made every month, for years to the same name. A. Whitlock, for quote 34. It had seemed innocuous at the time, but now it felt like a potential breadcrumb, an archivist, someone who dealt in history, in records, in stories. Perhaps this A. Whitlock wasn't just a service provider. Perhaps they were an ally, a confidant, the only other person Silas had trusted. Finding them would be difficult and possibly dangerous, but it was a thread, and a thread was more than she'd had an hour ago. First, she needed to retrieve the journals. She waited until well after dark. The city was a different creature at night, its familiar streets transformed into a landscape of shadow and light. She borrowed a hoodie from a lost and found bin at a bus station, pulling the hood low over her face. She approached the theater from the back, moving through the dark, narrow alleyways she had fled through hours earlier. The side door she had burst through was still unlocked, a gaping black maw. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped back inside. The air was cold and still. The silence was absolute. They were gone. She was sure of it. But the sense of their presence lingered, a foul residue in the air. Using the dim light from her phone, she navigated the backstage labyrinth to the office. The door was ajar. They had been inside. The room had been tossed. Papers were scattered across the floor. Drawers were pulled out. But the large trunk was still there. They had tried to pry it open. She could see the fresh scratches in the wood around the broken locks. But they must have been interrupted or decided it was too difficult to transport. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her knees buckle. The journals were safe. She worked quickly, her hands shaking as she transferred the leather-bound books from the trunk into her large backpack. It was heavy, the physical weight of the history she was now carrying. As she hefted the pack onto her shoulders, her light caught the ledger, still open on the desk. She flipped back through the pages, looking for the archivist. A. Whitlock. The payments were always sent to a post office box, but the earliest entries from decades ago listed an address. 113 Ash Street. It was in one of the oldest parts of the city. Before she left, something compelled her to walk out onto the stage one last time. In the center, directly over the hidden compartment, was a single fresh scratch mark on the floorboards, a long, thin line where someone had tried to wedge something into the seam. They had been looking. They hadn't found it yet, but they knew it was there. They would be back. She slipped out of the theater and into the night, the weight of the journals a heavy, grounding presence on her back. She was no longer just a victim, running from a threat she didn't understand. She was a guardian, just like Silas, and she was going on the offensive. Her first stop was 113 Ash Street. It wasn't a home. It was a small, dusty bookstore, its windows crammed with yellowed paperbacks and leather-bound classics. A small, hand-painted sign hanging in the window read, quote, 35, quote, the lights were on inside. Taking a deep breath, Alara Vance pushed open the door, a small bell announcing her arrival, and stepped out of the shadows and into the light. The bookstore smelled of aging paper, leather, and pipe tobacco, a scent so thick with history it felt like walking into the past. Books were stacked everywhere, on shelves that bowed under their weight, in teetering piles on the floor, on every available surface of the cluttered front counter. Behind the counter, surrounded by a fortress of literature, sat a woman who looked as though she had sprouted from the pages of one of her oldest volumes. She was elderly, with a cloud of white hair pinned loosely on her head and sharp, intelligent eyes that peered at Alara over a pair of half-moon spectacles. Quote 36, she asked, her voice a dry rustle, like the turning of a brittle page. Alara hesitated, the weight of the backpack suddenly feeling immense. This was the gamble. She was about to entrust her life, and Maya's, to a complete stranger, based on a name in a 50-year-old ledger. I'm looking for A. Whitlock, she said, her own voice sounding thin and uncertain. The woman's sharp eyes narrowed slightly. She placed her bookmark carefully into the heavy tome she was reading and closed it. I am Althea Whitlock. And you are? My name is Ilara Vance. The name hung in the air between them. Althea's expression didn't change, but Ilara saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition, caution, and something else. Something that looked almost like anticipation. It was the look of someone who had been waiting for a long time, Althea said softly, testing the name on her tongue. Quoted her 41. The relief that flooded Ilara was so profound she felt dizzy. She hadn't made a mistake. This was the right place. You knew him. I knew him, Althea confirmed, her gaze unwavering. For over 40 years. He was my client and my friend. He was a very lonely man, carrying a very heavy burden. A burden I see you have brought with you. She gestured with her chin toward the backpack. Ilara slowly unshouldered the heavy pack and placed it on the counter. She unzipped it, revealing the stack of Silas's journals. Althea looked at them, and her stern expression softened into one of genuine sorrow. His voice, she whispered, reaching out a frail, steady hand to touch the worn leather of the top volume. I'm glad it wasn't lost. Over the next 2 hours in the quiet, book-lined sanctuary of the store, Ilara told her everything. The inheritance, the discovery under the stage, the appraisal, the men in the theater, the chase. She left nothing out. Althea listened without interruption, her steepled fingers pressed against her lips, her sharp eyes never leaving Ilara's face. When Ilara finished, the old archivist was silent for a long time. She rose from her stool, her movements slow but deliberate, and shuffled to a small kettle in the back. Silas always said the wolves would outlive him, she said, her back to Ilara as she prepared tea. He just hoped he could give his successor a head start. She returned with 2 steaming mugs, the fragrant scent of chamomile filling the air. The people who came to the theater, she said, finally meeting Ilara's gaze. Quote, 50 reais. She took a slow sip of her tea. Quote, 51. The story she told was one of calculated, systemic cruelty. Sterling had used its political influence to seize property under false pretenses, incited violence to drive residents out, and finally orchestrated a, quote, 52, a tragedy officially blamed on a gas leak that had wiped the last vestiges of Greenwood Park off the map. Althea continued, her voice low and somber. Quote, 54. Quote, 55. Ilara breathed. Quote, 56. Quote, 57. Ilara said. Quote, 58. Quote, 59. Althea confirmed. Quote, 60. A cold anger began to replace Ilara's fear. This wasn't just a threat anymore. It was an injustice. A deep historical wound that had been left to fester for 100 years. She looked at Maya's drawing of the puppet queen, which she had tucked into her pocket. She thought of her daughter's future. This was about more than just money. It was about what kind of world she wanted Maya to inherit. A world where the wolves always win, or a world where the guardians, however unlikely, stand their ground. Quote 61. Ilara asked, her voice steady now, filled with a resolve she didn't know she possessed. Althea gave her a small, approving smile. Silas and I had many years to think about that question. He knew he couldn't guard it forever. The plan was never to keep the money hidden. The plan was to find the right person to finally plant the seed. He chose you, Ilara. Me? Why me? I'm nobody. You are his family, and you are a mother, Althea said simply. You understand legacy in a way no one else can. You are not a nobody. You are the new guardian. And now, she said, her eyes gleaming with a fierce light, we stop waiting. We take the story to the world. The bell above the door chimed softly. Both women froze. A man stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit that seemed to absorb the shop's warm light. He was tall, with silver hair and a smile that was perfectly pleasant and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the man from the theater, the first voice. Quote 67, he said, his smile widening as his gaze fell on the backpack and the journals on the counter. Quote 68. The man in the suit closed the door behind him, the soft chime of the bell a jarringly cheerful sound in the suddenly suffocating atmosphere of the bookstore. He didn't seem threatening in an overt way. There was no visible weapon, no aggressive posture. His menace was far more refined. It was in the calm, proprietary way he surveyed the room, as if he were assessing an asset he already owned. It was in the cold, reptilian stillness of his eyes. "Mr. Sterling," Althea said, her voice betraying no fear. She spoke his name as if it were a curse. "To what do we owe the displeasure?" He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Always so direct, Althea. I see you've been keeping busy. I should have known Silas would have a confederate, a keeper of the lore." His gaze shifted to Alara, and his smile tightened. "And you must be Ms. Vance, the heir apparent. I apologize for my associate's lack of subtlety earlier today. It's so difficult to find good help." Alara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but she met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. She saw the cool arrogance in his eyes, the absolute certainty of his own power. He was a man who had never been told no, a man for whom the world was simply a collection of things to be acquired. "What do you want?" Alara asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "What I want," Sterling said, taking a slow step toward the counter, "is what belongs to my family. What you have there," he gestured to the journals, "is a fiction, a dangerous, slanderous fairy tale cooked up by a madman. And what is hidden in that theater is stolen property. My grandfather's associates made a number of informal loans in the Greenwood Park district. Loans that were never repaid. That money is the settlement of a century-old debt." The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He was twisting history, recasting the victims as debtors and the thieves as righteous collectors. "You burned their homes," Alara said, her voice trembling with a cold rage. "You erased them." Sterling waved a dismissive hand. "Unfortunate, but necessary urban renewal. Progress has a price. Now we can resolve this in one of two ways. The simple way is that you tell me exactly where in that theater the assets are located, you hand over those diaries, and you walk away. In return for your cooperation, the Sterling Group will provide you with a finder's fee, let's say $5 million, tax-free, enough to ensure you and your daughter live a very comfortable life, far away from here." The offer hung in the air, seductive and poisonous. $5 million. It was a staggering sum. It was escape. It was safety. It was an end to this nightmare. For a fleeting second, she felt the pull of it, the siren song of an easy way out. Then she looked at Althea, whose face was a mask of calm defiance. She thought of Silas, alone in his theater for 50 years, guarding a promise. She thought of the families of Greenwood Park, their lives and legacies turned to ash. This wasn't her money to bargain with, Alara asked. Sterling's smile vanished. It was a declaration of war. He was threatening to take Maya. The fear that shot through her was sharper and more painful than anything she had felt before. It was a cold, sharp blade twisting in her gut. She felt Althea's hand gently touch her arm, a small, grounding gesture of solidarity. "You think you are powerful, Mr. Sterling," Althea said, her voice quiet but resonant. "But all your power is rooted in a secret that has been kept for 100 years. What do you think happens when that secret is no longer a secret?" Sterling turned his cold eyes on Althea. "No one will believe you. An old woman and a desperate single mother peddling a conspiracy theory against one of the city's oldest benefactors. It's pathetic." "History is not a conspiracy theory," Alara said, finding her voice again. "Those journals are proof. Pages of scribbling from a lunatic?" he scoffed. "They prove nothing." "They contain the names," Althea interjected. "The names of the families, the original guardians. Do you know how many descendants of Greenwood Park are still out there, living ordinary lives with no idea of the legacy that was stolen from them? They are doctors, teachers, mechanics, artists. All it would take is one journalist, one curious historian, to start connecting the dots. The story isn't in those journals, Mr. Sterling. The journals are just the key. The story is in the blood." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Sterling's face. He had underestimated them. He had assumed they would be focused on the money, that they would think like him. He had not anticipated that their weapon was not the fortune, but the truth. He regained his composure quickly, smoothing the front of his jacket. Alara countered. "Alara," her voice ringing with newfound strength. Sterling stared at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a cold, calculated fury. The mask of civility had fallen away, revealing the predator beneath. Quote to Minor University, he said softly. Quote 94. He turned and walked to the door, his movements precise and controlled. He paused with his hand on the knob. Takush, quote 95, he said without turning around. Quote 96. And then he was gone. The bell chimed and the door clicked shut, leaving a profound and chilling silence in his wake. He knew about the puppet. He had been watching them. He had been watching Maya. The threat was no longer veiled. It was personal. It was immediate. Ilara sank onto a stool, her legs giving way. The $5 million bribe felt like a distant memory, a foolish temptation from another lifetime. The battle lines had been drawn, and the first shot had been fired, aimed directly at the one thing in the world she could not bear to lose. The aftermath of Sterling's visit was a heavy, suffocating blanket of fear. His final words, the casual, chilling mention of Maya in her drawing, had transformed the conflict from a high-stakes battle over money and history into something far more primal. He had made it clear that her daughter was on the board, a pawn in his cruel game. For the rest of the night, Ilara and Althea sat in the bookstore, the journals spread across the counter, the world outside forgotten. The initial shock gave way to a hardened resolve. Sterling's threat had been designed to paralyze her with fear, but it was having the opposite effect. It was forging her fear into a weapon. Quote 97, Althea said, her voice a low, angry hum. Quote 98. They spent hours poring over Silas's journals, not as diaries but as strategic documents. Althea, with her archivist mind, helped Ilara see the patterns, the connections. Silas had done more than just wait. He had spent his life gathering evidence. Tucked within the pages were newspaper clippings of Sterling Group acquisitions, obituaries of key players, and cross-referenced lists of family names from Greenwood Park, with notes on where their descendants might have settled. It was a roadmap of justice. Quote 99. Ilara said, tracing a family tree Silas had meticulously drawn. Quote, $100. Quote, 0101. Althea agreed. Quote, 1002. Their plan began to take shape, whispered in the quiet sanctuary of the bookstore. It was audacious, risky, and centered on the one thing Sterling couldn't control, the narrative. They would not fight for the money. They would fight for the story. The first step was to secure the evidence. The next morning, under the cover of a gray, pre-dawn drizzle, they returned to the theater. Althea, surprisingly agile for her age, stood watch while Ilara, her nerves screaming, slipped inside. She retrieved the old ledger and a box of Silas's photographs of the original puppets, each one named after a Greenwood Park family. She worked with a frantic, focused energy, her fear a constant metallic taste in her mouth. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind, sounded like Sterling's footsteps. Before leaving, she stood on the stage and looked out at the empty seats. The theater wasn't just a hiding place anymore. It was a vessel, a stage, and it was time for one last performance. Back at the bookstore, they began their campaign. Althea, it turned out, was not just a book dealer. She was a retired university historian, a respected academic who had been pushed into early retirement for her, quote, 103, quote, views on the city's sanitized official history. She still had contacts, a network of former students, fellow historians, and independent journalists who trusted her. While Althea reached out to her network, planting the seeds of a story about a major historical discovery, Ilara focused on the descendants. Using Silas's notes, she began the painstaking work of tracing the family lines. She spent days in the library's genealogy section, cross-referencing public records, searching for the children and grandchildren of the ghosts of Greenwood Park. Her first successful contact was a man named Ben Carter, a retired high school history teacher in his late 60s. His grandfather, the original owner of a thriving tailor shop in Greenwood Park, was one of the names in Silas's journal. When Ilara called him, his initial reaction was cautious disbelief. The story of Greenwood Park was a piece of painful, half-forgotten family lore, a tale of a sudden misfortune that had shattered his family's prosperity. He had never known the details. Ilara didn't mention the money. She simply told him she was a researcher who had uncovered the personal journals of a man who had known his grandfather. She read him a passage from Silas's journal, a description of the pride his grandfather took in his work, the feel of fine wool under his hands. Ben was silent for a long moment on the other end of the line, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. He agreed to meet. The meeting took place in a quiet corner of a public park. Ilara showed him photocopies of the journal pages, of a photograph of the puppet named Ben, stared at the image, his eyes welling with tears. Quote, Watomam 5, he whispered. Quote, Tonex. He became their first ally. Through him, they found others. A jazz musician in Chicago, a nurse in Atlanta, a young city planner right here in town. Each one had a piece of the story, a fragment of a memory passed down through generations. As Ilara brought them the truth of their own history, she could feel a community reforming, its bonds forged across time and distance by a shared legacy. Meanwhile, the Sterling Group began to move against her. The predicted legal assault began with a notice of intent. They were formally challenging the will, claiming Silas was not of sound mind. They filed a motion to have the theater sealed as a protected heritage site, a transparent attempt to gain legal access to the building. Then a black car began parking outside Maya's school during pickup and drop-off times. It never approached them, never did anything overtly threatening. It just sat there, watching, a constant, silent reminder of Sterling's reach. The pressure was immense. Ilara felt as though she were walking on a wire, the safety of her daughter on one side, the weight of a 100-year-old promise on the other. There were moments of crippling doubt, nights when she lay awake, terrified she had made the wrong choice, that she was sacrificing her daughter's well-being for a cause that wasn't hers. In those moments, she would look at the drawing of the puppet queen, and she would think of Ben Carter's tears, of the quiet dignity of the descendants she had met. She was not just fighting against Sterling, she was fighting for them. The final piece of their plan was the most audacious. "We need a stage," Althea had said, "a place to tell the story where he can't silence us." Ilara knew there was only one place it could be. With a small loan from Ben Carter and a handful of other descendants who now believed in her, she hired a crew, not to renovate the Orpheum Grand, but to make it safe for one night. They repaired the faulty wiring, cleared the debris, and brought in generators to power a simple set of stage lights. They didn't fix the peeling paint or the decaying seats. The decay was part of the story. They sent out a single, simple invitation to a list of independent media, local historians, and community leaders. It announced a special historical presentation, quote, 109, quote, to be held at the long-abandoned Orpheum Grand Puppet Theater. The night before the event, Ilara was on the stage, arranging Silas's puppets on simple wooden stands. The tailor, the doctor, the baker, the teacher, each one a silent testament. The theater was quiet, but it no longer felt empty or menacing. It felt full, expectant. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "There is still time to accept my offer. 10 million. Think of your daughter." Sterling's final gambit. Ilara deleted the message without replying. She looked up at the proscenium arch, at the brass plaque with its cryptic warning. "The strings are attached to everything." She finally understood what it meant. It wasn't a curse. It was a statement of fact, a reminder of connection, of responsibility, of legacy. Sterling thought he could pull her strings with money and fear. He was about to find out she was no one's puppet. The night of the performance, a cold, persistent rain fell over the city, slicking the streets and blurring the streetlights into hazy constellations. It was a miserable night, the kind that encouraged people to stay home. Ilara stood just inside the theater's lobby, her heart a frantic, unsteady rhythm, convinced no one would come. The small crew she'd hired was in place, the generators hummed softly in the alley, and the stage was set with a single lectern and the silent, watchful audience of Silas's puppets. Althea stood beside her, a calm, unwavering presence in a simple black dress. Ben Carter and a dozen other descendants of Greenwood Park, people who had traveled from 3 different states, milled about nervously, their faces a mixture of hope and apprehension. They were strangers to one another, united only by the ghosts in their blood. At 7 o'clock, the scheduled start time, the theater was still mostly empty. Despair, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of Alara's resolve. Had it all been for nothing? Had Sterling won without even having to fight? Then a car pulled up, then another. A young woman with a press pass hanging from her neck ducked out of the rain, followed by a grizzled older man with a camera. An independent blogger Althea knew, a local history professor from the university. Slowly, in twos and threes, they began to arrive. Not a crowd, not a mob, but a small, curious gathering of about 50 people, drawn in by the mystery of the invitation. They picked their way through the decaying grandeur of the theater, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, their faces illuminated by the simple work lights casting long shadows on the walls. Alara saw them in the back, just as she knew she would. Sterling, flanked by two other men in identical dark suits. He wasn't there to stop the show. It was too late for that. He was there to watch her fail, to witness the story fall on deaf ears, to see it absorbed and forgotten by the decaying velvet and dusty air. He caught her eye and gave a small, condescending nod, a king observing the futile efforts of a peasant. Alara felt a surge of cold fury, and it burned away the last of her fear. She walked backstage, her heels clicking with a confidence she didn't feel but desperately projected. Althea gave her arm a final reassuring squeeze. "Silas is with you," the old woman whispered. "They all are." Alara stepped onto the stage. The single spotlight found her, and the low murmur of the audience died away. The silence was absolute. She looked out, past the lights, into the sea of shadowed faces. She saw the descendants in the front row, their faces upturned, hungry for a history they had been denied. She saw the curious, skeptical faces of the journalists, and in the back she saw the silhouette of the man who threatened to destroy her life. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Alara Vance," she said, her voice clear and steady, amplified by a simple microphone. "A few weeks ago, I was a single mother working 2 jobs to make ends meet. The only thing I had ever inherited was my mother's stubbornness. Then I inherited this place, the Orpheum Grand Puppet Theater, a place my family told me was haunted." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. They were right. It is haunted. It's haunted by the ghosts of a community called Greenwood Park. She didn't use notes. She didn't need them. The story was etched into her soul. She told them about Silas, the lonely guardian. She told them about his father, the first protector. And she told them about the promise he had kept for over half a century. Then she stepped away from the lectern and walked over to the puppets. She picked up the first one, the Queen Maya had been so taken with. "This is Queen Bess," she said, holding it up for the audience to see. "Silas named her after Bessie Coleman, the aviator, but she represents another queen, a woman named Eleanor Mayfair, who ran the most popular bakery in Greenwood Park. Her recipes were a legend. Her husband was a doctor." One by one, she introduced the puppets. The tailor for Ben Carter's grandfather, the teacher for a woman who had started the first free library for children in the district, the architect for the man who had designed the community's church. With each puppet, she wove a story, using the details she had gleaned from Silas's journals. She brought the people of Greenwood Park to life. She spoke of their dreams, their ambitions, their community. She painted a vivid picture of a world that had been stolen and buried. She never once mentioned the money. This wasn't about a fortune. It was about a theft of legacy, a crime of erasure. The fortune was just a symptom of the disease. The story was the cure. The audience was captivated. The journalists were scribbling furiously in their notebooks. The photographer's flash went off, a silent pop of light in the gloom. In the front row, Ben Carter was weeping silently, his face a mask of grief and profound, validating pride. Alara could feel the energy in the room shifting. The story was taking root, coming alive in the hearts of the people listening. It was no longer just her story or Silas's story. It belonged to everyone now. Finally, she put down the last puppet and returned to the center of the stage. Quote 118, she said, her voice ringing with passion. Quote 119. She looked directly toward the back of the theater, into the shadows where Sterling stood. Quote 120. She finished, her voice echoing in the profound silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single person in the audience began to clap. It was Ben Carter. Then Althea joined in. Then the journalist, the professor, and soon the entire room, save for the three men in the back, was filled with. He had come to watch a fire fizzle out, and instead he had just witnessed a spark that would ignite a blaze he could not control. He turned, his movements stiff and angry, and stormed out of the theater, his associates trailing behind him like shadows. He was gone. He had lost. The story was free. The night of the performance was not an ending, but a beginning. The applause that echoed in the old theater was the first tremor of a seismic shift. The journalists and bloggers who had attended did not just write stories. They launched crusades. The Ghosts of Greenwood Park became a headline, a hashtag, a rallying cry. The narrative, once Sterling's to control, now belonged to the people. In the days that followed, Ilara's life was a whirlwind. Her phone rang incessantly. The story was picked up by national news outlets. Historians from across the country began to re-examine the city's official records, finding the cracks and omissions that pointed to the truth of Greenwood Park. The Sterling Group, which had stood for a century as a pillar of civic benevolence, was suddenly cast in a harsh, unforgiving light. They issued a series of terse, dismissive statements, calling the story a baseless fabrication, but the dam of their secrets had been breached. The pressure mounted. Ilara, guided by Althea and a pro bono legal team that had materialized overnight, presented copies of Silas's journals to the state attorney general. An official investigation was launched, not just into the historical claims, but into the Sterling Group's current business practices. They were a dynasty built on a lie, and the lie was unraveling. Sterling and his associates vanished from public life, retreating behind a wall of lawyers and public relations specialists. The black car disappeared from outside Maya's school. The legal challenges to Silas's will were quietly dropped. The threats had ceased. They were no longer on the offensive. They were locked in a desperate defensive crouch. Ilara, however, found herself facing a new, more complex challenge. With the story out and the Sterling Group neutralized, the question of the fortune, the $358 million still resting silently beneath the stage, became paramount. It was a staggering sum, a tool of immense power, and its fate now rested squarely on her shoulders. The temptation was still there, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind. She could take a portion, a small fraction, and disappear. She and Maya could live a life of peace and security, far from the spotlight and the weight of this legacy. No one would blame her. She had earned it. But when she looked at her daughter, who now spent her afternoons at Althea's bookstore, devouring stories of forgotten histories, she knew she couldn't. To take the money for herself would be to betray the very principles she had fought for. It would validate Sterling's view of the world, a world where everything, including justice, has a price tag. It was Althea who showed her the way forward. Quote 102. The old woman said one evening, as they sat in the now famous theater. Quote 123. With the help of Ben Carter and the growing network of Greenwood Park descendants, Ilara established a legal trust. It was a complex, arduous process, but it was a labor of love. They named it the Greenwood Park Legacy Foundation. Its mission was simple: to use the wealth that had been stolen from the community to rebuild its spirit. The foundation's first act was to formally purchase the Orpheum Grand Puppet Theater. They didn't restore it to its former glory. Instead, they stabilized it, preserving its beautiful decay, and transformed it into a living museum and community arts center. The stage where Ilara had told the story would now be a place for new stories to be told. The puppets of Silas Vance were given a place of honor, their glass eyes looking out over a space that was no longer haunted by a secret, but filled with the vibrant energy of a community reborn. The foundation launched scholarship programs for students from underserved neighborhoods, provided grants to minority-owned businesses, and funded historical research to uncover other lost stories from the city's past. The money, which had been a symbol of a great crime, was transformed into an engine of justice and opportunity. It was planting seeds, just as Silas had hoped. Ilara did not become a billionaire. She took a modest salary as the foundation's executive director. She and Maya moved out of their cramped apartment and into a small, comfortable house with a yard. But their lives were not defined by extravagance. They were defined by purpose. Her life was no longer about survival. It was about stewardship. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after that first fateful visit, Elara stood on the stage of the Orpheum Grand. The theater was filled with the sound of children's laughter. A local school group was taking a tour, their faces filled with awe as they listened to Ben Carter, now the museum's lead docent, tell the story of the tailor. Maya was there, sitting on the edge of the stage, just as she had on that first day. She was holding the porcelain queen, whose chipped face had been lovingly restored. She was no longer just a puppet. She was a symbol of a legacy reclaimed. Elara watched her daughter, and a profound sense of peace settled over her. The weight she had felt on that first day was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. She had faced down the wolves and she had won, not by becoming like them, but by holding fast to a simple, unshakable truth. She walked over to the brass plaque, still affixed to the wall, its words now gleaming from a fresh polish. The strings are attached to everything. She ran her fingers over the cool metal. It was not a warning of entrapment, but a celebration of connection. The strings of the past were connected to the present, the pain of an old wound to the hope of a new future. The legacy of the dead was now in the hands of the living. Sterling had been wrong. A mother's love was not a weakness. It was a superpower. It was the force that had given her the courage to fight for a future worthy of her child, a future where the ghosts of the past could finally rest, and their children could finally dream. The theater was filled with light, and for the first time, Elara Vance felt truly, completely free.